Hello everyone, I'm Pauline Thornhill. Welcome to Land and Sea. Tonight we'll take you to the barrens of the southern shore, the range of the Avalon caribou herd. For more than a year now, Dave Quinton has been watching the herd and its battle with the brainworm, the parasite that's killed off thousands of animals. In this program, Dave traces the problem to its roots and reveals the remarkable chapter of wildlife history that brought the brainworm to Newfoundland almost 100 years ago.
The southern Avalon, home of the caribou. The famous Avalon herd, graceful animals. You can watch them from the road. This is their world, the open country, the windswept barrens. "40 years ago, the caribou had almost disappeared from the Avalon wilderness. Then, thanks to conservation efforts, the herd recovered and multiplied at an astounding rate. A few years ago, they numbered 7,000. Then came the crash. It seemed to be some sort of disease or neurological disorder. Lone animals were seen walking strangely in tight circles. Some seemed to have lost control of their hind legs. Unable to keep up with the herd or to feed, they'd eventually waste away and starve. In a few years, the herd had dwindled from 7,000 to 2,000 animals. It was all caused by a tiny parasite, so small it can barely be seen with the naked eye. The brainworm, as it's commonly called, had infected the Avalon herd. Where did this deadly little beast come from, and how did it get here to sweep like the Black Death through our caribou? It all began with Sir Wilfrid Grenfell, the internationally renowned medical missionary. Appalled at the poverty and malnutrition he saw in the north, Grenfell sought ways to better the lives of the people. He brought hospitals, he brought doctors and nurses to northern Newfoundland and Labrador. Handicraft production was encouraged, sawmills and cooperatives started. He even brought reindeer. Reindeer like these from northern Scandinavia. Impressed with how the people there had domesticated these animals, he wondered if the same could be done in Newfoundland. Reindeer would provide much-needed fresh meat and milk and clothing. It could also be a beast of burden and a means of transportation. And so, one day in the spring of 1908, a Norwegian ship arrived with a herd of 300 reindeer. The animals scrambled ashore and tasted for the first time the lichens and grasses of the New World. With the reindeer came 2 families of Laplanders, or Sami, to show local people how to handle the animals. People came from all over to see the reindeer and their exotic herdsmen, and everyone wondered if the experiment would work. But there were other immigrants that landed in Newfoundland that day. Tiny stowaways that no one knew anything about. The reindeer had carried the brainworm to Newfoundland. Little did Grenfell and the others realize these animals were harboring a parasite that would one day threaten the native caribou. When we return, a remarkable trek and the first signs of trouble. Among the supporters of Grenfell's reindeer experiment were the English owners of the A&D Pulp and Paper Company. Intrigued with the idea that reindeer could possibly replace the horses that then worked in the lumber woods, they arranged to have 50 animals brought to central Newfoundland. It was decided to herd the animals down the northern peninsula and overland to logging camps near Millertown in the center of the island. Hughie Cole, a young Englishman who worked for the logging company, was in charge of the expedition. With him came local herdsmen and a family of Sami. The guide was Matty Mitchell, a Micmac Indian who later discovered the mineral deposits at Buckens. Hughie Cole took some pictures and kept a journal.
March 5th, 6th, and 7th. The ice on Hare Bay was like a sheet of glass, difficult and dangerous for the reindeer. Decided to travel around the bay, which made our journey 40 miles longer. On the 7th, camped near Mainbrook Pond. Sunday, March 8th. Caught a few trout and one rabbit. The deer have to be watched very closely as they want to return to St. Anthony. We take 4-hour shifts during the night.
On and on they trudged, through fair weather and foul. On Friday the 13th, trouble.
Found River broken up and ice rafted. Very bad going. Unfortunately, one stag was badly bitten by the dogs today.
It was one of their best animals. From now on, it would cripple along. 5 days later, they woke to find the reindeer gone. It took the better part of the day to round them up. But there were 2 extra deer. A couple of local caribou had decided to join the herd. This is significant, as it's probably the first contact between reindeer and the local caribou. And the flirtation continued, for an entry on the 23rd reads,
Snow and high winds. 4 deer lost. All hands out looking for them. Returned to camp at dark. Deer still at large.
Next day, the deer returned and the trek continued. It was a remarkable journey through the wildest, coldest part of the island. High, mountainous country with fjords that cut deep into the land. They suffered frostbite and snow blindness and hunger. They struggled through storm and blizzard. Over the wild, barren roof of the northern peninsula they went, on to Millertown, without losing a single animal. An astounding accomplishment, a dramatic adventure. But up there on the mountains of the northern peninsula, another drama was quietly unfolding. The brainworm had been transferred from the reindeer to the caribou. It was not until the 1970s that sick caribou were first noticed and the disease positively identified. But there were only sporadic outbreaks, and most of us ordinary mortals didn't know much about it. On a trip to Brunet Island years ago, Bruce Porter and I encountered a caribou that was behaving in a most peculiar way.
Could that just be old age now, or could she have been shot maybe?
Well, she shouldn't have been shot because there's no season out here. but maybe old age. She may have fallen over a cliff, or it just might have been a birth defect.
She's all alone. She's not with a herd. Maybe
No.
she just can't keep up with them.
I'm sure she can't. Sure she can't keep up with them.
We didn't know it at the time, but the symptoms were classic. It was only a few years ago that sick caribou were first reported on the Avalon. The animals were exhibiting the same bizarre behavior, circling, weak in the hindquarters, unable to keep up with the others, eventually starving. Wildlife parasitologists were called in to check it out. Dr. Murray Lancaster of Lakehead University, who first identified the parasite, and his colleague, Dr. Prestwood of the University of Georgia. The specialists confirmed what local wildlife biologists suspected. The brainworm they'd been keeping tabs on in other herds had somehow managed to spread here to the Avalon Peninsula.
The outbreak down here was a surprise. And then we began to piece things together and discovered that the Avalon herd had been, the parasite had been absent down here in the Avalon. And it looks as though the severity of the disease is a result of the parasite encountering a naive population where no animals of any age had any prior experience with the parasite. And then it's particularly severe and cause a disease.
Do you expect digesting slugs?
The brainworm is not passed directly from caribou to caribou. Part of its life is spent living in a slug that's found on the barrens. The slug picks up the larvae of the brainworm from the caribou's droppings.
And under wet, foggy conditions is ideal for their movement, and they're up higher on the vegetation. Oh, I think we've got a couple here, Dave. The reindeer brought the parasite, and the intermediate host was already here. And these fellows are up on the vegetation when it's moist, and they're down in the soil when it starts to dry and get windy. When the caribou are eating low to the ground and ingesting vegetation. They eat these things accidentally. That's how they become infected.
And so, these tiny slugs are a crucial link in the life history of the caribou brainworm. They may be especially numerous and active here on the relatively warm southern Avalon. If so, this could help explain the severity of the brainworm outbreak here. But some say it's more than the brainworm attack. It's mismanagement. The herd was allowed to grow too large and overgraze its range. Gordon Cooper of the Wildlife Federation.
It's all a matter of overpopulation, and it's clearly illustrated by the Avalon herd, which we noticed in the mid-'80s. They were fine, healthy animals, big animals. And then as time went on, the range became more degraded, and the animals got smaller. And in the early 90s, we began to see them going around, staggering around with a rib sticking out of them, and they roved the barrens. They weren't feeding, and it was obvious they were starving to death. And as you know, when you get an overpopulated herd like that, what parasites are there will spread very quickly through a good percentage of the herd.
Others strongly disagree. There's no link between the brainworm attack and the size of the herd or the condition of its range, according to Shane Mahoney of the Newfoundland Wildlife Service.
The animals that have this worm and that are succumbing to the disease in any advanced stage look terrible. They're emaciated, they're weak, their skeleton shows through their skin. They all look poor. But the other animals that were not infected or not showing signs of the disease always look good. And as I said, we have classified this caribou population several times, and the calves look great. and the females are producing lots of calves, better than many other caribou populations we have on the island. In my opinion, there never was a serious nutritional stress in the Avalon Peninsula, based on the information that I have. There certainly are portions of its range that are not in the condition they were in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and that's true of every caribou population. But simply because range has been grazed upon doesn't mean that a caribou population has overgrazed its range, and we have no evidence to indicate that the Avalon herd has.
Last fall, we drove up the shore to where some hunters had downed a stag.
All you got to do then, fellas, is to detach it along the midline now, you see. Although it gets a little tough to see where you're going.
Doc Lancaster was there to give a hand, and at the same time gather some tissue samples to examine later back in the lab. With him was one of his post-grad students, Mark Ball of Grand Falls. They found that most hunters were quite cooperative and curious about their studies.
There's 4 chambers to the stomach, and this large one here is the rumen, and then that continues down here to the reticulum, and this is the omasum, and this is the abomasum. And yeah, as you can see, this abomasum is like a horseshoe or banana type like shaped organ, and that's the sample what we want for our study. So there's going to be a need to tie it off and keep as much as possible in this thing, in this organ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it up here at the posterior end. I'm going to tie it off. So I want to keep all that in there, so I'm going to tie it off right tight at that end. Then I'm going to cut it about a ½ an inch up above so I can keep all that content in there. You can see the sputus coming out of there.
And so the scientific investigation into the disease continues. The gathering of stomachs and brain tissue. Even the feet and droppings of the caribou are taken.
We might decide later to
So I'll just
take a good size.
take a scalpel and get
Yeah, take a slice down there, that'd be good. And if you use those tissue forceps, that'll help you to hang on to it. Well, that's it, yeah.
Here Mark slices a sample of the animal's lungs. It will all be studied closely later back in the lab, and hopefully provide us with a better understanding of the devastating little parasite that our caribou must now learn to live with.
What will happen now, as a prediction for the future, is that this herd will now develop resistance. And it will develop a certain amount of resistance which will begin to reduce the amount of mortality as a result of this worm. It will not eliminate it. Certain years when weather conditions are favorable, certain other factors may develop where we will again see some mortality. But I do not think we will see the rate of mortality we've seen before.
In February, I wandered over the Peters River Barrens. The caribou seemed healthy and robust, no sign of the disease. They let me walk among them. A sudden movement, and they'd bolt. But with patience, you can get quite close. Did they know I was harmless, that the hunting season was closed? Sometimes I wonder. I thought of Grenfell, who brought the reindeer to Newfoundland many years ago. Little did he know of the deadly parasite he was unleashing, of the sickness that would flourish long after the reindeer were forgotten, the disease that would eventually spread right across the island to reach even the isolated Avalon herd. These are the survivors. Hopefully they'll build up a degree of immunity. Hopefully the Avalon herd will bounce back. We stayed there on the Peters River country, mesmerized by the wintry majesty of the place and the beauty of the animals, till the sun dipped under the horizon and the caribou became pale ghosts drifting across the endless barrens.